Many US citizens make the mistake of filing a family petition for their child when their child is born abroad. Oftentimes, that child is already a US citizen, and the process is called acquisition of citizenship, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to be going through situations where your child may have automatically acquired US citizenship, where you don't need to file a family petition for them to enter the United States, what the process looks like for getting them evidence of their US citizenship, and going through some other details that might be relevant to this topic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Puyan Darian. I'm an immigration lawyer, and I go through weekly immigration topics, and I answer all of your questions in this channel. A common fact pattern that I see is when a US citizen gets into a relationship with somebody in a different country and they have a child together. And then the US citizen comes to me, does a consultation, and wants to know, how can I bring my child and my spouse over to the United States? And I often have to tell them, well, to bring your child to the United States, we just have to do a consular report of their birth abroad because they are actually already a US citizen. But to bring your spouse over, we need to go through the standard family petition process, filing a family petition, going through the consular process, or maybe even doing adjustment of status. I've done many videos on this specific topic. That's beyond the scope of today's video. We're just going to be discussing the consular report process. Not every child who is born abroad to a US citizen parent is automatically a US citizen. I'm going to be going through a couple different scenarios. So the first scenario is where two US citizen parents are residing abroad and they give birth to a child. If either of those parents previously resided physically in the United States, then that child is probably a US citizen, and all they would need to do is go to the nearest consulate or embassy, file a consular report of birth abroad. They can do the paper version or file it electronically, and they'll go through the process and eventually be able to get a US passport for that child to enter the US as a US citizen. Let's go through another scenario. Let's say a US citizen parent and an immigrant parent give birth to a child outside of the United States, but that child is born in wedlock. For purposes of this video, in wedlock is just going to mean that the child is born after the date of marriage. Although, technically speaking, it has a much more expansive definition for these purposes, especially when a parent dies within 300 days of the child's birth. So the child is born in wedlock. In that situation, the US citizen parent must demonstrate that they physically resided in the US for at least 5 years at some point in their life. And at least 2 of those years must have been after that parent's 14th birthday. And I think the purpose of this rule is they want to make sure that the parent has some real connection to the United States. They don't just want the parent to have been born in the US, be technically a US citizen, move out of the US when they're 1 year old, and be able to just transfer citizenship to a child 20 years later. They want to make sure that parent has physically lived in the US for at least 5 years, and at least 2 of those years are after their 14th birthday. Now let's go through another scenario. Let's say same fact pattern, but the US citizen and the immigrant parent are not married, and now that child is born outside of the US. So the child is born out of wedlock. That situation becomes a little more complicated. If the US citizen parent is a mother, then it's the same rule, basically. The mother must have physically lived in the US for 5 years, and 2 of those years must have been after the 14th birthday. But if it's the father, then there are actually some additional requirements. So when the US citizen parent is a father and the child is born outside of wedlock, you have to demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence that the child is yours. So basically, like, if there's no real evidence, then a DNA test would suffice. You also need to demonstrate that you've taken financial responsibility for the child until their 18th birthday. And there are actually a few other requirements, but those are the 2 big ones that don't apply to mothers and which do apply to fathers. Okay, so now you know the general scenarios where a child automatically acquires US citizenship. What do? So if your child has automatically acquired US citizenship, the first step is to contact the nearest embassy or consulate and file a consular report of birth abroad. If you just Google CRBA, you can find the online application process. You don't need to physically go to the consulate, but actually after you file it, you do need to be available to attend an interview at the consulate where they're going to verify some stuff. And after you report the birth of your child to the consulate, you can then apply for their US passport so that they can enter the US with evidence that they're a US citizen. I recently had a scenario where the child actually entered the US as a tourist, even though they automatically acquired citizenship abroad. And in that scenario, we can bypass the consular report of birth abroad because you cannot file that from within the US. You need to be outside of the US, and the only place you can file that is with an actual consulate. If you're physically inside the US and you believe you acquired citizenship, first of all, definitely confirm that you're a US citizen, but if you are, then you could just apply for a US passport from within the United States. The reason I'm emphasizing that you need to confirm that you're a US citizen before you apply for a passport is because if you're wrong, then that might be construed as a false claim to US citizenship. And if you falsely claim to be a US citizen, it has dire immigration consequences, which oftentimes are unfixable. The only way you could really fix a false claim to US citizenship is through a timely retraction of your false claim. So in a very short period of time, you need to try to correct the error. Otherwise, it might be a lifetime of immigration consequences. Alright guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you have questions about how to report the birth of your child abroad, or you want to do a consultation to discuss whether or not your child actually acquired US citizenship, or maybe that part's easy and you want to bring the child's parent over to the United States and do the family petition process, that's something I really focus a lot of my practice on. If you're new to my channel, be sure to like and subscribe. I put out videos on family-based immigration petitions on a weekly basis, and I'll see you guys next week for another one.